We can make sure people have affordable bills when it comes to their cell phone, which are paying the highest in the world. We can take on the big telecom.
Canadians shouldn't have to choose between having a cell phone and heating their homes. So we need to get to a place where the cost of cell service is more affordable.
It's one of the most common complaints among Canadians that their cell phone bills in this country are too high. Well, a number of party leaders are promising to do something about that should they win the federal election next month. But do they actually have the ability to lower cell phone costs? Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. He joins us now via Skype. Hi, Professor Geist. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time today.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
Professor, before I get to the specific proposals from each of the parties, I was hoping that you could help me understand exactly how, quote unquote, bad the problem is. How, comparatively speaking to other countries, do Canadians pay more for their cell phone bills?
The short answer is yes. The situation is bad, and it's been bad for a long time from a consumer perspective. Study after study after study finds that Canadian consumers pay some of the highest rates in the world when it comes to cell phone usage, particularly for data, which is, of course, for many consumers, the prime use nowadays for smartphones and their wireless plans.
The industry put out, in response to a lot of these various proposals, something that says, among other things, that rates have been going down over the last 3 years. Is that correct?
Rates have been going down in Canada, but they aren't declining as quickly as they are in some other countries. And so part of the problem is that we started behind many of those other companies, at least from a consumer perspective, or some of those other countries, at least from a consumer perspective. And the gap in many ways continues to grow as we're seeing faster declines in other countries compared to what we see here in Canada.
Okay, so political parties are seized by this, and they've made various proposals. Let me start with the Liberal one and get your analysis of that. They're promising to lower cell phone bills by 25% and bring Canada in line with prices across the G7 countries. They will do this by working with telecom companies, they say, to offer plans comparable to global prices, encourage competition by expanding the entry of Canadian mobile virtual network operators in the market, and if prices don't fall in 2 years, then they would consider lowering the entry and investment threshold for MVNOs, lowering the rates at which MVNOs get access to networks, and expand the CRTC mandate to make affordable pricing for consumers a core objective. Will that work?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I would start with a couple of points. First, I think the 25% reduction is not the right metric to be using for actually some of the reasons we just articulated. Even if we do decline by 25%, if other countries are declining faster by 30 or 40%, the gap between what Canadian consumers are paying and what consumers in other countries is actually going to even increase over that time. So what really matters is how we stand relative to other countries, much the same way when we measure our pharmaceutical prices. We take a look at what prices are in other countries and try to ensure that Canada is somehow kind of in the middle, at least average, and consumers aren't overpaying. We ought to be doing much the same thing when it comes to the wireless side. In terms of their plan to get to this reduction, regardless of how you measure it, some of it doesn't strike me as all that hopeful. The notion that they can talk their way through this by working collaboratively with the telecom companies hasn't worked in the past, either for the Liberals or for the Conservatives when they were in government. Those companies have long put up barriers to new entrants and more competition, and there's every reason to think they'll continue to do so. The hope for more competition, though, around MVNOs, I think is the right one. But I think it's going to present its own set of challenges. The government or the Liberals rather, are sort of saying we'd like to move in that direction, but they're not jumping in with both feet as they start saying, well, we'll allow some of those competitors to come in, but we're going to have to wait at least a couple of years before we kind of really open up the marketplace. Given where we stand right now, I don't think there's any reason to wait. We ought to be jumping in with as much potential new competition in the marketplace as possible.
Is competition, from your perspective, key? Like, is that should be the primary focus?
Absolutely. Competition is the the key to unlocking, I think, better pricing from a consumer perspective. In fact, the Liberals seem to recognize this. I mean, one of the things that I find a bit odd about their positioning is that if you take a look at what they've done over the last 12 to 18 months, they've actually put into place, I think, some pretty important changes, a new policy direction from the ISED Minister Navdeep Bains that prioritized more forms of competition. They pushed back to the CRTC the prospect of MVNOs. That seemed to put us on the right track. And this was an opportunity, I would have thought, to say, here's what we've been doing so far, and here's where we're going to continue to go. Instead, this talk about talking with telecom companies and kind of not jumping fully into the MVNO type competition, or perhaps even more, saying they want to go fully with respect to an open market in terms of foreign investment.
Okay, so now let's move on to the NDP. Their proposal includes putting a price cap on cell phone bills to make sure Canadians are not paying more than the global average, and they're claiming that that will save Canadians $10 on every cell bill on average. And they want to also end data caps and require companies to offer affordable, unlimited plans for cell phones. And they're proposing a telecom consumers bill of rights that will, quote, put an end to the outrageous sales and service practices of big cell and internet companies. Your evaluation of their proposals?
Well, their emphasis seems generally to be on price regulation as opposed to competition. I mean, the idea of a Bill of Rights is something that the CRTC has already been engaged in. And so the headline-making part of what they've been focusing on is putting in some kind of caps on the prices we pay. And I think the problem with that is that ultimately actually decreases the amount of consumer choice that we might end up with, because what's going to happen is that the various providers are going to go to the market, they're going to see whatever the cap happens to be, they're going to price at the cap, and basically it's going to be just sameness across providers, and Canadian consumers will get roughly the same plan from each of the different providers faced with this kind of capped approach. And I don't think that that elimination of the ability for providers to compete, whether it's by different services or different pricing, which I think is an important part of how you achieve a better marketplace, a lot of that will be lost, I think, in a price-regulated environment.
So if the next government comes to you and says, Professor Geis, what's the most important thing we do to combat the relatively high, compared to other countries', prices Canadians pay for cell phone services and data services, what would your answer be?
I'd point to at least three things. I would say first, an emphasis on competition, and that means, I think, going forward with full MVNOs immediately, as well as, I would argue, opening up the marketplace to foreign competition as broadly as possible. I think we've got to see the parties stop with the possibility of new fees and levies on wireless services at the same time as they're talking about reducing prices. So we've had the Heritage Minister talking about making internet companies pay more to help support Canadian content. You can't, on the one hand, say you want to increase the fees associated with internet access in order to fund some other social programs like CanCon, and at the same time say that you're concerned about affordability and pricing. And so I think we got to recognize that there's a real inconsistency there. And then finally, the government has launched its Broadcasting and Telecommunications Review that is scheduled to provide its findings early next year. I think the starting point coming out of that review has to be affordability and competition. For too long, our policies haven't emphasized those kinds of issues, and that's, I think, where our starting point has to be.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks for your insight this evening, Professor Geis. Appreciate it. That's Professor Michael Geis out of the University of Ottawa. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.